It began on a quiet morning just before dawn, the kind of hour when even the wind seemed to sleep and the neighborhood lay wrapped in silence. Daniel Cole turned off his truck's engine and exhaled, exhaustion pressing deep into his shoulders after another long night shift at the base. The black pickup gleamed faintly under the dim glow of the streetlight as he parked neatly in his own driveway, the same driveway he'd poured concrete for himself 10 years ago when he first moved in. He sat for a moment, enjoying the stillness, the hum of the engine fading, the world perfectly calm. But calm never lasted long on this street, not with Karen living across from him. Her curtains twitched before he even stepped out. He could see the glow of her phone lighting up her face as she peered through the window. Karen didn't sleep much. She preferred to watch. Watching was her sport. She called it maintaining order, but everyone else called it nosy, controlling, and downright obsessive. Daniel opened the truck door quietly, hoping maybe this time she'd let him be. But the moment his boot touched the pavement, her front door flew open. "Excuse me," she shouted, her voice slicing through the quiet like a siren. She was wearing her robe, hair in messy curls, a coffee mug in one hand, and a clipboard tucked under her arm, because of course she never went anywhere without her clipboard. "You can't park there," she barked, storming down her driveway. Daniel turned, confused. "Morning, Karen," he said calmly. "It's my driveway." She gasped like he had said something blasphemous. "That's not the point," she snapped. "This is a private community with rules. Driveways are for vehicles approved by the HOA. Daniel blinked. "Approved?" he repeated, fighting the urge to laugh. "It's my truck. I've lived here for years." Karen planted her feet, hands on her hips, and glared. "That's not what the community book says. I've already filed 2 reports about that vehicle. It's too large, too loud, and it doesn't fit our image." Daniel's patience was thin after 12 straight hours of coordinating military logistics, but he wasn't about to argue with a woman holding a mug that read HOA Queen. He sighed. "Karen, it's 5:30 in the morning. Go inside." But she wasn't done. She raised her phone like a sword and shouted, "If you don't move it, I'm calling the police." He almost thought she was bluffing. Almost. Then he saw her finger tap the screen. It took her less than 30 seconds to dial 911, and less than 3 minutes for the first patrol car to appear, lights flashing blue against the sleepy cul-de-sac. A second one followed, because apparently a suspicious vehicle and a trespasser was serious enough to justify backup. Curtains opened, silhouettes moved, and sleepy faces peeked through blinds. Daniel stood still beside his truck, arms folded, watching the show unfold. Karen hurried over to the officers like she was leading a crime scene investigation. "That's the one," she said, pointing dramatically. "He parked illegally, and I'm sure he doesn't even live here. Probably some construction worker cutting corners. We have rules about outsiders." The younger of the 2 officers nodded politely, approaching Daniel with caution. "Sir, may I see some ID, please?" he asked, his tone professional but wary. Daniel said nothing for a moment. He could have argued, could have told them the absurdity of the situation, but years in command had taught him that calm was more powerful than anger. Without a word, he reached into his jacket, pulled out his wallet, and handed over his identification. The older officer took it, shining his flashlight across the card. The moment the beam hit the laminated seal, his posture changed. His back straightened, his jaw tightened, and the tension in his shoulders softened into something else: respect. He blinked, squinting closer to confirm the name and the emblem printed in gold across the bottom. "Sir," he said slowly, "are you Colonel Daniel Cole, of the 12th Terran Command?" Karen frowned, confused. "What's that supposed to mean?" she asked. The officer ignored her. He turned fully toward Daniel, his tone shifting instantly. "Colonel, I apologize for the intrusion. We received a report," Daniel interrupted softly, "about a man parking in his own driveway." The younger officer swallowed hard, clearly embarrassed. Karen's face twisted. "Colonel? What kind of rank is that?" "This isn't a base, this is a neighborhood," she said mockingly, still convinced she was right. The older officer finally turned to her. Colonel Cole is an active duty officer in the U.S. Army. He has every right to be here. And this vehicle, he gestured toward the truck, is government registered. You've just reported a federal asset as suspicious. Karen's mouth fell open. The neighbors behind their windows froze, whispering among themselves. For the first time in years, Karen didn't have words ready. That can't be true, she stammered. He doesn't look like. She stopped herself too late. The officer's tone hardened. Like what? Daniel spoke up then, his voice even, calm, the kind of tone that carried authority without needing volume. Officer, thank you for coming out. You're just doing your job. He looked directly at Karen. As for you, if you ever feel unsafe again, maybe knock before you call the entire precinct. Or better yet, mind your own property. The older officer gave a small nod, something between apology and salute, before handing Daniel's ID back. Understood, sir. We'll make a note on file about the incident. The younger officer, still red-faced, followed his lead. Have a good day, Colonel. Then, with an unmistakable air of discomfort, they turned toward Karen. Filing false reports wastes police resources. This is your warning. Karen tried to laugh it off, her voice shaking. I didn't know. I was just enforcing HOA rules. The officers said nothing, stepping back into their cars. The patrol lights faded down the street, leaving Karen standing alone on the curb, her robe clinging to her ankles, her coffee long forgotten on the hood of her car. Daniel walked past her without a word, unlocking his front door. The morning sun began to rise, casting golden light across the driveway. Karen opened her mouth as if to speak, but no sound came. He glanced back once, just once, and said quietly, "Next time, Karen, read the name before you make the call." Then he stepped inside, closing the door gently behind him. Inside the house, the silence felt heavier now but cleaner somehow. He set his keys down, rubbed the bridge of his nose, and let out a tired chuckle. Years of commanding troops across foreign bases and hostile zones, and somehow, it was a suburban neighbor who nearly had him arrested. He brewed a cup of coffee, staring through the blinds as Karen paced in her driveway, probably rehearsing excuses for her next HOA meeting. By mid-morning, the neighborhood was alive with murmurs. Everyone had seen the lights, everyone had heard the shouting. Mrs. Henderson from next door called under the pretense of checking in. But really, she just wanted to know if the rumor was true. "Did they really salute you?" she asked, voice full of awe. Daniel smiled faintly. "They did their job," he said simply, ending the call politely. Across the street, Karen wasn't handling the humiliation well. She stood in her yard with her phone pressed to her ear, whispering urgently, probably to the HOA president, trying to spin the story in her favor. Daniel could imagine it, how she'd claim misunderstanding, how she'd call it a safety concern. But it didn't matter. The moment that officer saluted, the balance of power in the neighborhood had shifted. That afternoon, Daniel sat on his porch, watching as the mailman hesitated before stepping onto his walkway. The man raised a hand respectfully. "Morning, Colonel," he said with a grin. "Heard about the excitement earlier." Daniel shook his head, amused. Nothing to get excited about. Just a misunderstanding. Karen's blinds twitched again. She hadn't come outside since the officers left. She was probably searching for new HOA rules to hide behind. But there was no rulebook for what she had just learned. No clause about what to do when the man you tried to humiliate outranks everyone you've ever met. As night fell, Daniel walked out one last time to lock his truck. The air was cool, the moonlight sharp against the polished hood. From across the street, Karen's voice finally broke the silence. "Colonel," she called softly, hesitant, almost unsure. He looked up. She stood at the edge of her yard, robe replaced by a pressed blouse, pretending calm. "I didn't realize who you were," she said. He nodded once, his tone even. "You didn't have to." She tried to laugh, but it came out hollow. "Guess I owe you an apology." He smiled faintly, not unkindly. "You owe yourself one," he said, then turned. the porch light flickering on behind him as he stepped inside. That night, Karen stayed awake long after the neighborhood went quiet, replaying the morning in her head, the sirens, the flashing lights, the moment the officer's voice changed when he said Colonel. The woman who had once thought she ruled the neighborhood had met someone who didn't need to raise his voice to remind her who truly commanded respect. And as dawn came again, the first light hitting the same driveway where it all started, Karen didn't shout, didn't complain, didn't even open her door. She just watched silently from her window as Daniel's truck pulled out, the military tags glinting briefly in the sun before disappearing down the road. It wasn't fear that held her there, it was something she'd never felt before in her suburban kingdom. Humility. Karen spent the next morning spinning her version of the story like a spider weaving lies into silk, pacing her porch with a phone glued to her ear as she told every neighbor who would listen that she'd only called the police to keep the neighborhood safe, that the whole thing was a misunderstanding and that she had no idea the man across the street was one of those military types. But everyone who had seen it with their own eyes knew better. They had watched her face turn red with embarrassment when the officer saluted Daniel, had seen her stammer and stumble, and now they whispered about it over hedges and fences while pretending to trim flowers or water their lawns. Daniel didn't say a word, didn't defend himself, didn't correct her version, because silence was more powerful than argument. He knew how gossip worked. He had seen soldiers turn rumors into wars. Instead, he went about his morning quietly, mowing his lawn, sipping his coffee, acting as though the entire incident hadn't even happened. But inside his calm exterior, a part of him was watching, observing how the neighborhood reacted, how faces that once smiled politely at Karen now turned away when she passed. For the first time, her self-appointed authority began to crack. But Karen was the kind of woman who mistook embarrassment for challenge. By noon she was on the HOA group chat typing paragraphs about unauthorized vehicles, security concerns, and non-compliant parking behavior, carefully never mentioning names but making sure everyone knew who she meant. When that didn't gain her support, she called the HOA president directly. "We can't have this kind of behavior," she hissed. "He's bringing military trucks into our peaceful community. What if there are weapons? What if—" "Karen," the president interrupted tiredly, "he's an active duty colonel, not a criminal." But she didn't hear that. She heard defiance, and defiance only made her louder. "Then I'll file an official complaint," she snapped. "If no one else wants to do what's right, I will." That afternoon, the HOA president, a balding man named Roger Davis who hated conflict more than anything, reluctantly walked across the street and knocked on Daniel's door. Daniel opened it still wearing his plain gray t-shirt and jeans, calm as ever. "Mr. Cole," Roger began awkwardly, "I know this is ridiculous, but I need to, discuss the incident from yesterday." Daniel raised an eyebrow, letting him fumble through his words. "Karen's filed a complaint saying your vehicle is disruptive to the community aesthetic." Daniel almost smiled at that. "Disruptive?" he repeated. "It's a government-issued pickup, Roger, not a tank." Roger chuckled nervously. I know, it's just, she's very vocal." Daniel leaned against the doorframe, arms folded. "I'm aware. So, what happens now?" Roger rubbed the back of his neck, clearly uncomfortable. "Normally we'd issue a warning or a fine, but I told her that's not possible without board approval. She wasn't happy about that." Daniel nodded slowly, then disappeared for a moment and came back holding a thick sealed envelope. "Here," he said, handing it to him. "If she insists on escalation, give her this." Roger frowned, glancing at the envelope. It had a federal seal stamped in red across the flap with the words "Restricted Access. United States Department of Defense." "What is it?" he asked quietly. "Documentation," Daniel said simply. "Nothing classified, just a formal notice verifying my current assignment and the registration details of the vehicle she's so concerned about." Roger's eyes widened slightly. "You really think she'll—" "Oh, she will," Daniel said with a faint smirk. "People like her always do." Roger sighed, nodded, and walked away with the envelope clutched like it was made of gold. Across the street, Karen was watching from behind her blinds, seething. She didn't know what they had talked about, but the sight of Roger leaving Daniel's porch with that official-looking document made her blood boil. She convinced herself it was some kind of intimidation tactic, that Daniel was using his rank to bully the HOA into submission. Her pride couldn't let her see the truth, that she had already humiliated herself. So that evening, she gathered her little circle of loyal followers, the ones who always agreed with her during board meetings because they feared her wrath, and held an emergency discussion in her driveway. "He's trying to scare us," she said, waving a printout of HOA bylaws. "Just because he wears a uniform doesn't mean he can ignore the rules." Her friends murmured, some agreeing, others clearly uneasy. "Karen," one of them whispered, "maybe we should just drop it. The police already came, and—" "No," she snapped, slamming her clipboard shut. "If we let him win once, he'll think he can do whatever he wants." By the next morning, she had drafted another letter, an official HOA violation notice accusing Daniel of parking a military-grade vehicle in a residential zone and displaying potentially intimidating behavior. She even took pictures of his truck under the early light, angling them dramatically as if it was some kind of armored machine. Then she slid the paper into an envelope and taped it to his mailbox. She didn't even ring the doorbell this time. She just smiled to herself and walked away, certain she had regained control. When Daniel stepped outside later that day, coffee in hand, and saw the envelope, he didn't react with anger or even surprise. He just sighed, peeled it off, and read it calmly. The accusations were absurd, full of legal phrases that didn't even apply to private property. He looked across the street where Karen was watering her plants a little too innocently, pretending not to notice him. He smiled slightly, almost pitying her, then turned and walked back inside. Inside his study, Daniel sat at his desk and began writing a brief report. Not to the HOA, not to the police, but to the local county registrar's office, a simple summary of harassment incidents tied to an HOA enforcement member exceeding her authority. He attached a few photos of the violation notice, added timestamps, and uploaded it to the county's digital record system. He didn't need revenge. He just needed documentation. The next day, Roger showed up again, this time looking pale. "Daniel," he said, lowering his voice, "I gave Karen the envelope like you asked. She called me 5 times afterward." Daniel raised an eyebrow. And she's terrified," Roger said with a nervous laugh. "She said she opened it, saw something about federal housing protections, and nearly fainted. She thinks she's under investigation now." Daniel chuckled quietly. "Then maybe she'll stop pretending she runs the government." Roger laughed, a real laugh this time, and shook his head. "You're not like most people she argues with," he said. "Most people fight back." "I don't fight people like Karen," Daniel said softly. "I let them fight themselves." That night, the neighborhood chat group was quieter than usual. The same people who once gossiped now stayed silent, unsure whose side they were on. Karen didn't post anything for the first time in years. Instead, she sat on her porch, scrolling through her phone, her jaw clenched tight. She had wanted control, but somehow she had become the one under scrutiny. Every neighbor who passed by glanced at her differently now, not with admiration or fear, but with quiet judgment. Her empire of petty authority was cracking, and she could feel it. Meanwhile, Daniel sat by his window, watching her through the faint reflection in the glass. He didn't hate her. If anything, he felt sorry for her. People like Karen didn't know peace because they couldn't control it. They needed chaos to feel important, and when someone refused to play their game, they unraveled. He sipped his coffee, the faintest smile tugging at the corner of his mouth, and whispered to himself, "Let her dig her own hole." By midnight, Karen was still awake, pacing under her porch light, phone in hand, her mind racing through scenarios. What if he really was reporting her? What if the HOA lost power? What if she'd gone too far this time? The thought made her stomach twist. But she couldn't stop. Pride was stronger than fear, and tomorrow, she promised herself, she would prove she still ruled this street. What she didn't realize was that Daniel had already set the pieces in motion. Quietly, methodically, like a soldier planning a campaign. And the next move, when it came, would remind her that the calmest man in the room is often the most dangerous one. The next morning rose heavy with humidity, the kind of sticky quiet that always came before trouble, and Daniel knew before even stepping outside that Karen wasn't done. He had seen that type of silence before, right before a storm hit or a plan went wrong. From his kitchen window, he saw her standing on the edge of her driveway, clipboard in hand, sunglasses on even though the sun was barely out. She wasn't alone. 3 of her HOA loyalists stood with her, whispering, holding phones, pretending they were on official duty. Daniel sighed, took a slow sip of coffee, and muttered, "Here we go again." He opened the door, calm as ever, the faint sound of his boots crunching against the gravel announcing his presence. Karen looked up instantly, her mouth tightening into a smirk that told him she'd been waiting for this moment. "Good morning, Mr. Cole," she said sweetly. "We're here on behalf of the HOA to discuss the matter of your vehicle's continued violation." Daniel raised an eyebrow, saying nothing at first, letting her talk, watching how her hands trembled just slightly, how her voice had that fake confidence she always wore when she was unsure. "You've ignored 3 notices," she continued, "and as of today, this is an official citation for non-compliance." She turned to one of her friends, nodding toward the mailbox. "Post it." The man, a tall, nervous neighbor Daniel barely recognized, walked forward, holding a bright orange envelope. He reached for the mailbox, but Daniel's voice cut through the air, quiet but sharp as steel. "Stop." The man froze mid-step. Daniel stepped off his porch and walked closer, the slow, deliberate stride of someone who didn't need to raise his voice to command attention. "Do you know what that mailbox is?" he asked, eyes locked on the man. "It's government property. Tampering with it is a federal offense. 10 years, minimum, if I report it." The man blinked, unsure if he was joking, looking at Karen for guidance. She rolled her eyes. "Oh, please," she scoffed. "You're trying to scare him." Daniel didn't even look at her. He kept his eyes on the man. "Go ahead," he said softly. "Touch it. See what happens." The man stepped back immediately, hands raised, muttering something about not wanting any trouble. Karen frowned, crossing her arms. "This is intimidation," she said loudly. "You're threatening HOA officials." Daniel smiled faintly. "Officials? Your neighbors with clipboards, Karen, not law enforcement." She bristled, color rising in her face. "We have authority," she snapped. "Authority to enforce community regulations." Daniel took another step forward, his calm unnerving her more than any anger could have. "And I have authority," he said quietly, "but the difference is mine doesn't end at a property line." The way he said it made even her friends shift uneasily. He wasn't bluffing, and everyone knew it. She tried to recover, flipping through her papers. "You think your rank matters here? This is private property under HOA governance. The military doesn't run this neighborhood." Daniel chuckled, low and quiet, the kind of laugh that came from someone who had seen too much to take petty arrogance seriously. "You're right," he said. "The military doesn't run it. But I own this house, and that means I decide what happens on this land. You can't override ownership with paperwork." The small crowd that had gathered on the sidewalk was silent now. A few neighbors stood watching from a distance, pretending to check their mail or water their lawns but clearly listening. Karen hated that. She could feel the shift, the way people were looking at her, not as the HOA's enforcer but as someone losing control. Her voice rose higher, desperate to reclaim it. "Fine," she shouted. "If you won't comply, I'll call another meeting. We'll vote on it." Daniel tilted his head slightly. "Vote on what?" "On having your vehicle towed," she snapped. Daniel smiled again, slow and calm. "You'd need the county's approval for that. Want to guess who your county liaison is?" She hesitated, not understanding. Daniel reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and tapped the screen a few times before showing her the contact list. One name highlighted under County Operations Director. "I trained him," Daniel said simply. "Served under me before I retired from active command." Karen's mouth fell open, her argument evaporating mid-sentence. Her friends shifted awkwardly, suddenly less confident in their leader. One of them, a middle-aged woman clutching a folder, leaned close and whispered, "Maybe we should just let this go." Karen turned on her sharply. No. He thinks he can scare us with his title, but I'm not afraid of him. Daniel sighed softly, almost pitying her. You're not afraid of me, he said. You're afraid of being wrong. But that's not something I can fix for you. He turned and walked back up his porch steps, his movement steady, his tone final. If you have any further issues, send them in writing through the county office. I'm done playing HOA games. Karen stood there, her jaw tight, shaking with a mix of rage and humiliation as he disappeared into his house. Around her, her friends began to drift away one by one, muttering excuses about lunch plans or errands, leaving her standing alone with her clipboard. For the first time, she felt the weight of the eyes watching her, not with respect, not even with sympathy, but with quiet amusement. The self-proclaimed queen of the HOA had been dismissed, not by shouting, but by calm authority she couldn't touch. That evening, Daniel received an email from the HOA board, polite and carefully worded, stating that all further concerns regarding parking enforcement would be handled internally. In other words, they were backing off. He leaned back in his chair, smiled faintly, and closed the laptop. Outside, the sun was setting over his truck, casting long shadows across the quiet street. He thought about how strange life was, that a man who had commanded fleets, negotiated treaties, and faced real threats now found his biggest challenge in a suburban neighborhood run by a woman with a clipboard. But it wasn't annoyance he felt anymore. It was perspective. People like Karen existed everywhere, just wearing different uniforms. Across the street, Karen sat on her porch, phone in hand, scrolling furiously through HOA bylaws, searching for any loophole she could find, but nothing helped. Every rule, every paragraph, every clause she cited collapsed under the same truth. She had no power outside her illusion of it. Her phone buzzed with a message from one of her allies. Maybe drop it, Karen. You're making things worse. She stared at the words for a long time, then tossed the phone onto the table and stared out across the road where Daniel's porch light glowed softly. There was no gloating, no victory celebration, just stillness, and somehow that silence hurt more than any insult ever could. As night fell, she finally went inside, her once perfect posture slumped, her confidence dimmed. Daniel watched the light go out from his study window and took one last sip of his coffee. The neighborhood was quiet again, peaceful the way it should be. But he knew it was only temporary. People like Karen didn't know how to stop. They only paused long enough to plot their next move. He smiled faintly, his voice low as he muttered to himself, "Round 3 will be interesting." And somewhere across the street, behind dark curtains and bruised pride, Karen was already thinking the same thing. The morning after her public embarrassment, Karen's pride was already boiling into something new, revenge. She'd spent half the night pacing her living room, replaying every word Daniel had said, every calm look he'd given her, the way his silence made her feel powerless. She wasn't used to that feeling. So, when the sun rose, she decided she'd turn the tables one last time. She'd prove to everyone that he wasn't untouchable. Around 9 o'clock, while Daniel was in his garage tightening the bolts on a tool rack, he heard the distant sound of police sirens again. At first, he didn't even look up. It wasn't unusual in this town. But then the sound grew louder, too close, too familiar. He walked to the front of his house just as 2 patrol cars turned into the street. The flashing blue lights bounced off the windows, and once again, neighbors peeked through their blinds. And there she was, standing proudly on her porch, arms folded, a smirk painted across her face. Karen had called the police again. This time, though, she wasn't yelling about parking. No, this time her story was darker. She had told dispatch that the military man across the street was storing weapons in his vehicle. It was a dangerous accusation, one meant to cause chaos. Daniel's jaw tightened, but his eyes stayed calm. He watched as the officers parked carefully, stepping out with a caution they hadn't shown before. One of them, the same younger officer from last time, looked uncomfortable. The other, a new face, seemed more stern. "Mr. Cole," the senior one called out, "we received a report about potential weapons being transported or stored in this vehicle." The neighborhood went silent. Karen, from behind her fence, pretended to look concerned, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "I told you something wasn't right with him. That truck doesn't belong here." Daniel didn't move right away. He simply crossed his arms, studying them both. "Officer," he said evenly, "do you have a warrant?" The senior officer hesitated. "No, sir, not yet. We just need to confirm some information." Daniel nodded slowly. "Then you'll confirm it the right way." His tone was still calm, but the authority in it carried weight. "I'll show you what you need to see, but first, you'll confirm who authorized this report." The younger officer glanced uncomfortably at his partner, then at Karen. Please step back," he told her firmly. Karen blinked, caught off guard. "What? No, I'm the one who called. I'm helping you." The officer's voice hardened. "And now you'll stay out of the way." Daniel walked toward the truck, opened the back seat, and revealed a neat stack of sealed metal cases. "These," he said, "contain classified navigation hardware, standard issue for command officers. They're locked and tracked by federal inventory." The senior officer took one look at the serial tags, and his face went pale. He turned toward his partner and whispered something Daniel couldn't quite catch, but he already knew what was coming. Within seconds, the younger officer's posture changed. He stood straight, hand resting at his side in a formal stance. The senior one took a step back and cleared his throat. "Sir," he said carefully, "you're still listed as active duty clearance under the Department of Defense." Daniel nodded. "Correct. You can verify that through my contact at Fort Hamilton. His number's on the credential card in my wallet." The officer took it, read the name, and his expression shifted entirely, from suspicion to recognition. Karen frowned, stepping closer, her voice trembling between anger and disbelief. "What's going on? Why aren't you arresting him?" The officer turned slowly, his eyes cold now. You've just filed a false report against a high-ranking military officer. Do you understand what that means?" Her smirk vanished. I was just doing my job," she stammered. You thought wrong," he interrupted sharply. "You accused a decorated colonel of illegal possession on federal property." The younger officer, now standing tall, took a step forward, saluted Daniel cleanly, and said, "Sir, we'll make sure this doesn't happen again." The sound of that salute echoed across the silent street, and every curtain twitched. Every neighbor watching knew the line had been crossed too far this time. Karen stood frozen, her face pale, the clipboard slipping from her hand onto the pavement. "Colonel," she whispered, the word sounding foreign in her mouth. Daniel looked at her for a long moment, then finally spoke, his voice quiet but sharp as a blade. "You've spent your life trying to control people, Karen. But some people don't answer to you. And the next time you think about calling the police, make sure you understand who you're calling them on." The senior officer gave Daniel a respectful nod. "We'll handle the paperwork, sir. Again, apologies for the disturbance." Daniel simply nodded and walked back toward his porch as the officers returned to their cars. Karen tried to follow them, pleading, "Wait. You don't understand. I thought he was dangerous." But no one listened. The officers drove off, leaving her standing alone under the weight of a neighborhood that was now watching her, not him. Someone laughed quietly from across the street. She spun around, humiliated, muttering curses under her breath, before storming back into her house. Her empire of fear had crumbled in one morning. Inside his home, Daniel sat by the window again, his expression unreadable. He wasn't smiling, but there was peace in his eyes. Not victory, peace. He'd seen what happened when power was abused, when people acted out of pride instead of purpose. He had no interest in destroying her. He just wanted her to understand that respect wasn't demanded, it was earned. Outside, the neighborhood was alive with quiet whispers, stories spreading like wildfire. Karen called the cops again. They saluted him this time. "Did you see her face?" Every sentence ended the same way, with laughter. As dusk settled, Daniel stepped onto his porch. The air was cooler now, the tension drained from the street. Across the way, Karen's curtains remained drawn. The same woman who once strutted through the neighborhood like a self-appointed sheriff now hid behind her windows. Daniel leaned against the railing, watching the sunset. The world didn't need punishment for people like her. It just needed truth, and truth had a way of humbling the loudest voices. He whispered to himself, almost like a promise, lesson delivered. The days that followed were quieter, but in that silence, something was shifting. The neighborhood that had once revolved around Karen's voice now whispered behind her back instead of listening to her. Every morning she would step outside pretending everything was normal, watering her plants with a fake smile, but her hands shook every time a car slowed down near her house. The fear of what she had done gnawed at her pride, and the humiliation of that officer's salute burned hotter than any fine or punishment could have. Across the street, Daniel lived as if nothing had happened. His lawn was trimmed, his truck gleamed under the sun, and his posture carried that same calm authority that made everyone second-guess crossing him. To most, it seemed like he'd moved on, but deep down he could still feel the tension clinging to the air like smoke that refused to clear. He knew people like Karen didn't fade easily. Pride didn't die, it waited for an opening. It came on a Thursday afternoon, when Daniel noticed 3 cars parked together near the cul-de-sac. From his window, he saw the HOA board gathered there: Roger, Denise, and of course, Karen, who looked determined again, clutching a new stack of papers. He sighed quietly, already predicting what was coming. Within minutes, the trio walked up his driveway. Roger looked uncomfortable, Denise avoided eye contact, but Karen's smirk had returned, brittle but sharp. "Mr. Cole," Roger began weakly, "we wanted to clarify some things regarding the vehicle situation." Daniel folded his arms, expression calm but cold. "I thought the police already did that," he said. "They did, but this isn't about law enforcement," Karen interjected quickly, her voice rising with false confidence. "This is about HOA regulations. We can't have special treatment just because someone wears a uniform." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Special treatment?" he asked, his tone dangerously quiet. "You've been harassing a homeowner, filing false reports, and wasting police resources, and you think I'm the one getting special treatment?" Karen's chin lifted defiantly. "You're making the board look weak. We have rules, and if we don't enforce them, this neighborhood will turn into chaos." Daniel stepped closer, the faint crunch of gravel under his boots the only sound. "Chaos?" he repeated softly. "You called chaos on yourself when you forgot what those rules were for, to serve the community, not control it." His voice didn't rise, but the power in it made Roger flinch. "This meeting's over," Daniel said flatly. But Karen wasn't done. She pulled out a folded sheet from her clipboard and waved it in the air. "This is a fine," she snapped, "for non-compliance. You'll pay it, or we'll take further action." Daniel took the paper from her hand without even looking at it, glanced at the HOA header, then tore it cleanly in half and handed it back. "Then take your action," he said, his tone low and final. Denise gasped softly, and Roger muttered, "Karen, maybe we should—" "No!" Karen shouted, her voice trembling with anger. "He can't just ignore the board." Daniel's eyes met hers, calm and piercing. "I outrank your board, Karen. I outrank every system you hide behind. You can keep your paper rules. I live by real ones." She froze, unable to answer, her face pale with fury. "Now," Daniel continued quietly, "if you're finished trespassing on my property, I suggest you leave before I start writing my own reports." His meaning was clear. The board turned without another word. Karen hesitated a moment longer, trying to find one last spark of authority, but when she met his gaze again, she looked away first. That night, Daniel sat on his porch as a soft wind rolled through the trees. The neighborhood was still, the kind of still that comes when everyone's afraid to make noise. He could see the faint glow of lights in Karen's windows, pacing shadows flickering behind the curtains. She was unraveling, trapped by the same control she once wielded. It would have been easy to feel satisfaction watching her crumble, but Daniel didn't. He had seen that kind of pride before, in soldiers, in leaders, in himself. It always ended the same way, with isolation. She wasn't his enemy. She was a reminder of what happens when people let power become their identity. The next morning, the HOA sent a formal notice through email, not to him, but to every homeowner in the subdivision. It was short and curt. All complaints regarding Colonel Daniel Cole's property are considered closed. Further interference will result in disciplinary review. That one sentence broke the last of Karen's image. By noon, half the neighborhood had forwarded it around, some adding laughing emojis, others posting screenshots on the community chat. Daniel didn't respond to any of it. He didn't need to. Silence was winning for him. Across the street, Karen sat on her porch staring blankly at her phone. Her friends weren't texting anymore. The ones who used to follow her now avoided her completely. Even Roger had stopped answering her calls. For the first time, she had no audience. Pride had always been her armor, but now it was cracked and heavy, and she didn't know how to take it off. When Daniel came outside that afternoon to wash his truck, she looked up briefly, meeting his eyes. He didn't smile or gloat, he just nodded once, acknowledging her like a teacher acknowledging a student who finally learned a hard lesson. She looked away, swallowing whatever she was about to say. As evening settled, Daniel sat on his porch again, the faint hum of crickets filling the air. He thought about the strange irony of it all, how a simple parking complaint had turned into a battle of pride and respect. All he'd ever wanted was peace. But sometimes, peace wasn't given freely. It had to be earned through patience, restraint, and quiet strength. He took a sip of his coffee, watching the orange glow of sunset spill across the rooftops. The neighborhood was calm now, the kind of calm that comes after a storm that everyone learned something from. And as Karen's porch light flickered out across the street, Daniel knew the war was finally over, not because he had won, but because she had finally stopped fighting. Weeks passed, and the neighborhood slowly returned to its peaceful rhythm. But it wasn't the same peace as before. It was quieter, calmer, almost reverent. The gossip that once buzzed every morning had died out completely, replaced by the soft hum of sprinklers and the sound of children riding their bikes again without being scolded for touching the sidewalk lines. People had started smiling at each other more, waving from porches, talking about things that actually mattered. The fear that once hung in the air whenever Karen's name was mentioned was gone, replaced by something new: respect for Daniel, the man who had stood firm without shouting, who had fought nonsense with patience and arrogance with truth. He didn't speak much of it. He didn't have to. The whole neighborhood already knew. They'd seen him stay calm while others lost control, and that silence spoke louder than any speech ever could. Karen's house, once the center of all activity, now looked strangely empty. Her porch light rarely came on. The loud barking of her voice, the lectures, the constant tapping of her clipboard, all gone. The only sound that came from her place now was the faint hum of regret. Daniel's life slipped back into his simple rhythm. Every morning he'd brew coffee, walk his perimeter like he always did, check the fences, tighten a screw here and there, and then sit on the porch to watch the sun come up over the trees. To him, peace wasn't about victory, it was about control, about knowing where his boundaries were and keeping them clean. He still got the occasional salute from the same officer who had once been called to arrest him. The patrol car would slow down at the end of the street, and the officer would raise a hand respectfully before driving on. It always made Daniel smile faintly, not out of pride but gratitude. He'd been in battles across oceans and deserts, but somehow this little suburban street had tested his patience more than all of them combined. One morning, as he sat outside sipping coffee, he noticed something he hadn't seen in weeks: Karen. She stood across the street, dressed simply, no clipboard, no robe, no sunglasses, just a plain shirt and jeans. She looked smaller somehow, not physically but in presence. She hesitated for a long time before finally walking across the street. Daniel didn't move, didn't speak, just waited. When she reached the edge of his driveway, she stopped, her eyes flicking to the concrete as if she were afraid to step too far. "Colonel," she said quietly, the first time she'd ever used his title with respect instead of sarcasm. "I wanted to say, I'm sorry." Her voice cracked slightly, but it wasn't fake this time. "I let things get out of hand. I thought I was keeping order, but I was just making enemies." She glanced up at him, eyes tired. You didn't deserve that. Daniel studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he stood and walked closer until they stood a few feet apart. Karen, he said finally, people make mistakes. What matters is if they learn from them. She nodded, hands twisting nervously. I did, she whispered. I promise you, I won't ever. You don't have to promise me anything, Daniel interrupted gently. Just be a better neighbor. That's enough. There was a long silence between them, but it wasn't tense, it was quiet, cleansing. She nodded again, turned, and walked back to her house. As she did, she paused once to look over her shoulder. Daniel gave her a small nod. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, it was acknowledgement, and that was more powerful than any apology could ever be. After that day, something changed for good. Karen didn't try to control anyone anymore. She started attending HOA meetings quietly, listening instead of leading. She even went out of her way to help the elderly couple on the corner fix their mailbox, something that would have been beneath her before. The others noticed, and slowly, they began to let her back in, not as the queen of the neighborhood, but as just another neighbor trying to do better. The shift was subtle but real, and Daniel saw it from afar with quiet satisfaction. Months later, during the community's annual Independence Day gathering, Daniel was sitting under a tent with a few neighbors when Karen approached holding a plate of homemade pie. I made too much, she said awkwardly. He smiled, taking a slice. You're improving, he said lightly. She laughed nervously, trying to, sir. The word sir wasn't mockery this time, it was respect. He nodded in approval, and she smiled, maybe for the first time without that old hint of superiority. The air between them was different now, healed in ways only humility could manage. As night fell and fireworks began to crackle across the sky, Daniel leaned back in his chair, watching the colors burst and fade. Around him, the laughter of neighbors filled the air. The same people who once divided into whispers now mingled freely like an old family reunited. And across the street, he saw Karen again, sitting quietly on her porch, her face lit by the glow of the fireworks. For the first time, she looked peaceful. Daniel smiled faintly, his voice barely above a whisper as he looked up at the fading sparks. Peace earned is peace kept, he said to himself, repeating the same words he had once told his men after a long campaign overseas. He took one last sip of coffee, set the mug down, and let the night breeze wash over him. The battle that had started with shouting, lies, and police lights had ended not with revenge or punishment but with understanding, the kind that lasts longer than pride ever could. The lawn was still his, the driveway still his, but now even the air around his house felt different, lighter, freer. By the time the fireworks faded and the last echoes rolled through the hills, the neighborhood lights began to flicker off one by one. Daniel stood, stretched, and looked around one last time. The street that once felt like a battlefield now looked like home again. He glanced toward Karen's house, dark, quiet, peaceful, and nodded to himself before turning to go inside. He didn't lock the door this time. He didn't need to. The war was over, respect restored, and for the first time in a long while, Daniel Cole felt exactly what he'd fought for all his life. Peace, simple and earned, shining quietly beneath the stars. Months rolled by, and the neighborhood that once thrived on tension now breathed easier, its quiet streets filled again with laughter, trimmed hedges, and barbecues instead of police sirens and HOA patrols. The story of the morning Karen tried to have Daniel arrested had become a kind of legend, passed around in whispers to new residents who never quite believed it was true until they saw Karen herself go silent whenever Daniel's name was mentioned. For Daniel, life moved on easily. He went back to his routines. The kind of peace only a man who had seen too much chaos could appreciate. Each dawn, he'd step outside with his mug of coffee, the steam curling into the soft morning air, and take in the simple perfection of his home. The truck parked neatly in the driveway, the flag swaying gently from the porch, and the calm hum of a neighborhood finally learning how to coexist. But even in that peace, his eyes carried that sharp stillness, the kind of watchfulness that never truly fades in a man trained to command. He wasn't just living there anymore. He was guarding it, quietly ensuring no one ever tried to tear down that peace again. Karen, on the other hand, was a shadow of who she used to be. The clipboard was gone. The loud voice that once barked orders over fences was quiet, and the arrogance that once wrapped her like armor had cracked completely. She still lived across the street, still waved politely now and then, but she walked softer, spoke quieter, and for the first time since anyone could remember, she listened more than she talked. She had been humbled, not by fines or punishment, but by the truth that all her power had meant nothing in the face of real authority, the kind that came not from rules but from respect. She never told anyone what that morning had felt like when the officer saluted Daniel right in front of her. She didn't have to. Every time she saw his truck parked in the same spot, polished and steady, it was reminder enough. One evening, late in the summer, the HOA gathered for its annual meeting at the clubhouse. It was supposed to be routine, budgets, neighborhood plans, small talk, but this one felt different. Daniel, who usually avoided such gatherings, showed up for the first time. When he walked in, the room went silent for a moment, and even Karen, sitting near the back, straightened unconsciously. Roger, the HOA president, welcomed him with an uneasy smile. "Colonel, glad to see you here tonight," he said, trying not to sound nervous. Daniel nodded politely, taking a seat at the end of the long table. "Just Daniel tonight," he replied softly. The meeting went on as usual until Roger reached the section titled Community Conduct. He cleared his throat awkwardly and said, We've updated some rules this year, mainly to make sure everyone here feels respected in their own space." The room murmured quietly, eyes flicking toward Daniel and then to Karen. "We'd also like to take a moment," Roger continued, "to recognize the residents who helped remind us what respect and patience look like in this community." Then he turned to Daniel and said simply, "Thank you for setting that example." The applause that followed was light at first but grew stronger, the kind of clapping that carried genuine gratitude rather than obligation. Karen clapped too, slowly, almost shyly, her head bowed. Daniel nodded once, humbly, and said, "I just wanted peace. Nothing more." Then he stood up and added, "Rules are good, but they mean nothing if we forget why they exist. To help, not to hurt." The room was silent for a long time, every word sinking deep. And in that silence, something finally healed. After the meeting, as people left chatting quietly, Karen approached him hesitantly. "Daniel," she said softly, stopping a few feet away, "thank you for coming tonight." He turned to her, his expression calm. "You've changed," he said, and it wasn't an insult, it was acknowledgement. She nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. "I had to," she admitted. "I learned more from losing to you than I ever did from winning over anyone else." Daniel studied her for a moment, then extended his hand. She blinked, surprised, then shook it. "We all have to grow up sometime," he said. "Some of us just take longer." She laughed quietly, almost in relief, and for the first time since their feud began, she felt something she hadn't felt toward him before, respect. As autumn settled in, Daniel's house became the quiet heart of the neighborhood. He didn't host parties or lead events, but people often found themselves walking past his yard just to wave or say hello. There was a sense of reassurance in his presence, as if his calm kept the chaos at bay. When kids accidentally ran across his lawn chasing a ball, he didn't scold them, he just smiled and tossed it back. And when a new family moved in down the block, Karen herself went over to welcome them instead of measuring their fence height. The street had finally learned balance, and though no one said it aloud, they all knew who had taught them. One chilly evening, Daniel sat on his porch watching the sunset bleed gold over the rooftops. The sky glowed like a painting, and a cool wind rustled the trees. Across the street, Karen stood at her mailbox, sorting letters, and after a moment, she looked up and waved. He raised his coffee cup in return, a small gesture that carried years of history behind it. There were no grudges anymore, no tension, just quiet understanding. As the light faded, he thought about everything that had happened, how something as small as a parking dispute had spiraled into something larger. A reminder that respect, once lost, takes strength to rebuild. He had seen wars fought for less, but here, in this small corner of the world, he'd seen something worth more than victory, redemption. When darkness finally fell, Daniel went inside, turned off the porch light, and paused for a moment at the door, looking back at the driveway where everything had begun. The same truck sat there, still, silent, and proud. It wasn't just a vehicle anymore, it was a symbol, the quiet line that had drawn the boundary between pride and peace. He smiled faintly, whispered, "Mission accomplished," and closed the door behind him. The neighborhood slept soundly that night, wrapped in the calm left behind by a man who had taught them that real strength never needs to shout. It just stands firm, steady, and unshaken, even when the whole world mistakes silence for surrender.